Humility is a really simple card that can get a little complicated. Today, I'm using humility to talk about layers. So, in keeping with the usual structure of these videos, let's talk about what humility does. Humility is an enchantment that costs 2 and 2 white mana, and while it's in play, each creature loses all abilities and is a 1/1 creature. So, that's pretty cool. We'll come back to this guy, but first, layers. Layers are pretty complicated. This is, in fact, the third version of this script as it kept getting off the rails, and the whole point of all this was that somebody mentioned they didn't really understand layers well, and a new card has come out that deals with them, and so I figured I could try and help explain layers in a way that is simple. The scripts that resulted from this effort were excessive, to say the least. I went into detail on some really niche interactions like opalescence and humility, and then I looked back and I realized I was digging way too deep into the minutia instead of just focusing on the core concept. So hopefully this is one of the simplest ways to look at layers that is still true. First off, what are layers and why do we use them? The layer system in Magic is simply used to give structure to the order of continuous effects. You can think of it like a checklist whenever 2 or more continuous effects interact with each other. For example, Copy Artifact is a card that becomes another artifact when it comes into play. This sounds like a triggered ability, but it actually isn't. This card creates a trigger that can be responded to when it's coming into play, but it doesn't use the stack when it's in play to become something else. It's a continuous effect that continuously happens. And so this card uses the layer system to determine when its effect is applied in relation to other continuous effects. I will be going over some hopefully simple examples later, so if this is still confusing, don't worry. There are only 7 layers, but some of the layers have sub-layers as well. I promise this isn't confusing. Let's just talk about the layers, and it'll become more clear. Layer 1 is the first layer that applies its effects. This layer can be thought of as the clone effects layer, or the copy effects layer. So cards like Copy Artifact and Clone would apply their effects before other continuous effects. This basically means that a card that clones something will work properly regardless of what's on the field, or at least that object will change before the other effects are applied. Layer 1 technically has sublayers. Layer 1A is the layer that deals with everything I just mentioned, and sublayer B deals with face-down cards and applying defining characteristics to those face-down cards. That basically just means that when a card is turned over, it will become a 2/2 creature unless whatever turned it over specifies differently before any other effects are applied. A little caveat is that sometimes they will become like a 3/3 creature, or like sometimes face-down cards aren't a 2/2 creature, but if it doesn't specify, that's what it becomes. Fuck, I'm not helping to make this not confusing. Layer 2 is concerned with control changing effects, and those would apply after copy and face-down card modifications occur. This layer affects cards like Control Magic, an enchantment with a continuous effect that gives you control of a creature. Layer 3 comes next, and this layer is concerned with text changing effects. This includes cards like Sleight of Mind and Magical Hack. Layer 4 deals with type-changing effects. This basically means anything that's on the type line of a card, which affects types, super types, and subtypes. Living Plane is an example of a card that uses Layer 4 as it gives all lands in play the creature card type. This card does more, but that's a different layer, so we'll come back to that. Layer 5 deals with color-changing effects, such as Thought Lace. If a card changes the color of another card, that effect is applied in Layer 5 after any effects that are affecting anything that are applied in Layers 1 through 4, including the sublayers. Not complicated, this is very simple, it's just a checklist. You don't necessarily have to remember every effect, and you can look this up when you're going to figure it out. It's just a checklist. Layer 6 affects abilities adding effects, keyword counters, ability removing effects, and effects that say an object can't have an ability. For example, humility says creatures lose all abilities. That would be handled in Layer 6. As another example, Goblin King gives goblins Mountain Walk and +1/+1. The Mountain Walk part of this ability is applied in Layer 6. The last layer is Layer 7, and Layer 7 handles power and toughness changing effects. This means that effects that modify power and or toughness will do so after all other effects that don't modify power and or toughness have been applied. So Living Plane makes land creatures 1/1s, and Humility does the same thing to all creatures, and Goblin King gives +1/+1 to all goblins. All of those would be handled in Layer 7. Layer 7 has 4 sub-layers to deal with when exactly different types of modifications would occur. Layer 7A applies effects from characteristic defining abilities that define power and or toughness. For example, Tormoglyph is a creature whose power and toughness are equal to the number of card types in the graveyard, and +1 for toughness. This is a characteristic defining trait, and these effects are applied first before other power and or toughness modification. Layer 7B applies effects that set power and or toughness to a specific value. So Humility turns creatures into 1/1 creatures, and Living Plane turns lands that are now creatures also into 1/1 creatures. These are both examples of an effect that would be applied in sublayer 7B, after all the effects applied in layers 1 through 7 and sublayer 7A. Layer 7C applies effects and counters that modify power and or toughness, but don't set it. This is when you'd add +1/+1 counters or -1/-1 counters, or when cards like Goblin King would apply their power and toughness buff. Layer 7D applies effects that swap power and toughness. And I think that one's kind of self-explanatory. Okay, so those are the layers that determine the order of continuous effects. I think one of the most confusing aspects of this system is that this is a step-by-step system, but continuous effects use this system continually. It's automatically performed by the game engine constantly. These rules aren't something that triggers, this is just the order of things as they happen constantly. You're really just interpreting how these systems interact, but they are never turned on or off. This can be really confusing. But 1, it doesn't really come up all that often, and 2, it isn't as confusing as people think. It's just there's a lot to it. I'm going to run through the layers one more time, then we'll do a couple of examples, and then I'll slip my thoughts on Humility and why we're at it. So, the layers. Layer 1A, Clone Effects. Layer 1B, Face Down Cards. Layer 2, Control Exchange Effects. Layer 3, Magical Hack Effects. Layer 4, Type Line Change Effects. Layer 5, Color Change Effects. Layer 6, Ability Modifying Effects. Layer 7A, Tormoglyph Power and Toughness Effects. Layer 7B, Setting Power and Toughness Effects. Layer 7C, Add or Minus Power Toughness Effects. Layer 7D, Switching Power and Toughness Effects. Okay, so I'm hoping that anyone that's been confused by layers is starting to understand this. These interactions can be complicated, but most of this never really comes up, so don't feel intimidated if this is tricky to understand, and it's really not something that you need to understand as a casual player in most instances. But let's look at a couple of examples. Living Plane is a pretty cool card. Living Plane turns all lands into 1/1 creatures, which means it affects layer 4 since it modifies a creature type, and it affects sublayer 7B since it sets a creature's power and toughness to 1/1. In some ways, it's kind of like Humility, but it is a little different. So what happens if you have a Humility and a Living Plane in play? For the record, it doesn't matter which card came into play first in this specific example. Now, if you're trying to learn how layers work, go ahead and pause the video and see if you can work out this interaction on your own. It's okay if this is still confusing. I'm going to explain this interaction in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. With both a Living Plane and a Humility in play, Layer 1 will not be affected, and the same is true for Layer 2 and Layer 3. Layer 4 will be involved since Living Plane adds the creature type to all lands in play. Layer 5 isn't something that we have to worry about, nothing is changing its color. Layer 6 does come up since Humility will remove all abilities from creatures, and since all lands are creatures, that means no lands in play can be tapped for mana, or any other ability, actually. Layer 7 is the final layer, and since we have 2 abilities that are setting the power and toughness, both of these effects would be applied in sublayer B. When you have more than one effect that's in the same layer and sublayer, you apply the effects in timestamp order unless there's a dependency. What does dependency mean here? Don't worry about it. The effects here are applied in timestamp order. So the card that was in play first would apply its adjustment, and then the next card that just came into play would apply its adjustment. That's not relevant here because the end result is the same, but it is definitely worth keeping in mind in most situations where the end result would not be the same. You can probably see how this gets pretty complicated, especially since I used a pretty simple example and it still took a lot of words to explain. I really like Humility, because this card is such a rules engine wrench. Perfectly designed to confuddle and confuse, and I think that's beautiful. I don't really have too much more to say on Humility that doesn't involve going way deeper into layers and making this already confusing as fuck topic way more confusing, so I think we'll save talking about Opalescence and Humility for a different video, since I really just wanted to help people understand the core conceit of layers. Let me know in the comments if this helped you out at all, because it's a complicated topic and I'm probably not the most qualified person to be explaining this. And if you are well versed in the rules, like a high-level judge or something, and you noticed any mistakes I made, please comment and explain my errors. I'll pin the comment. So also check for a pinned comment calling me stupid instead of just taking my word on this. That being said, I do want to take this moment to pivot just a little bit. Normally, I don't really talk about new cards here all that often or like at all, but Abigail Eloquent First Year was mentioned in the comment about layers, and so let's just talk about this card for a little bit. So this card is kind of confusing from a layers perspective. For one, it has a triggered ability which applies a continuous effect. I'm pretty sure that works in the rules just fine, and I don't have any complaints about it, but it is worth noting. Anyway, Abigail enters and removes all abilities from a creature and puts a flying counter, a first strike counter, and a lifelink counter on that same creature. So this card was mentioned, but it wasn't really explained to me like what was confusing about it, so I'm just gonna kind of walk through it and see if I can figure out what was confusing. This card only affects layer 6, and while you would think that would simplify the situation, it's actually kind of the opposite. Because if you remove all abilities from a creature, wouldn't that apply to the abilities granted by the counters? And the answer is yes. Yes, it would. These effects are all in the same layer, and they're also on the same card, meaning that they have the same timestamp. So how do you determine the order? This uses the dependency system that I mentioned earlier and didn't think I would need to talk about because I didn't look at this card until after I did the script. Anywho, an effect is said to depend on another if 3 conditions are met. Condition 1, they are applied in the same layer and, if applicable, the same sublayer. Check. That is a big true for our girl Abigail here. Condition 2. Applying the other would change the text or the existence of the first effect, what it applies to, or what it does to any of the things it applies to. That's a big check. If we applied these effects in a different order, the counters wouldn't matter at all. And the third condition, neither effect is from a characteristic defining ability, or both effects are from a characteristic defining ability. That's also true. Basically, this effect would do nothing if applied one way, so it's applied the other way because of the dependency. Does anything in this video make any fucking sense? I don't know. Like I said, I don't know what actual confusion was caused by Abigail, so I would just assume it's about the dependency because everything else happens in the same layer, so unless it was just, ooh, layers, confusing, I don't know what else is confusing about this card. Hopefully, someone learned something from this. I want to talk about the art for Humility now. Humility was illustrated by Phil Foglio, and this art is some of the best art in Magic. This shit slaps. It's so fucking funny, and it brings me such joy, and the fact that this art exists on one of the more complicated and brutal stacks pieces just brings joy to my heart. Look at this shit. It's amazing. I love this art so much. The technique he used on the dragon's belly is really fantastic as well. It almost makes the dragon type creature thing look like it sparkles, which I think is kind of funny. But yeah, I guess that's really all I have for you today. Layers can be pretty fucking confusing, but hopefully this helped in some way. I'm not a teacher, so I hope that I express this information in a way where it makes sense and hopefully did not make too many errors. Yeah, hopefully you learned something, I guess. But yeah, I guess other news while we're here. Video uploads will be slowing down for a while, and I guess, in fact, already have. I have a couple of projects in the background I'm working on, and they aren't going as well as I would like, so I need to spend more time on those projects, meaning less time for these videos, at least for a little while. Otherwise, I guess you can like the video if you liked it. You can subscribe if you give a shit, but either way, I hope you have a magical day. Thank you for watching.